They buried the truth beneath Manhattan's concrete veins, hoping no one would ever hear the whispers that still echo there. But listen closely. Can you hear it? A woman's voice, thin as air, repeating the same prayer over and over until the words dissolve into madness. That sound once belonged to the walls beneath Broome Street, where between 1834 and 1867, the Murphy family built a nightmare so vast, so deliberate, that even death could not silence it. You were never supposed to know this. The city itself has done everything it can to erase the memory. Bricked foundations, sealed records, hushed scandals. But rot has a way of bleeding through stone, and once you know, you can never unknow. This was not a prison, not in the way the history books pretend. This was a machine of control, designed to feed on shame and bleed profit from the bodies of the forgotten. Officially, it was called the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women. But ask yourself, what kind of correction kills 3 out of every 4 who enter? What kind of Christian discipline leaves only bones and broken spirits in its wake? Behind the facade of charity, Patrick Murphy and his kin created something more sinister than a dungeon. It was a template, a prototype for the psychological cages that still surround us today. You see, once you strip a person of name, identity, and time itself, you own them. That is the secret the Murphys perfected. It wasn't just their fists, or their chains, or their starvation cells. It was the precision, the calibration of terror. They knew exactly how much light to take from a room before hope withered. They knew how many days a person could endure silence before she began confessing sins she had never committed. The newspapers of the day called it a house of piety. Judges sent their cases there by the dozen. Clergy praised its moral order. Businessmen spoke of the Murphys as model citizens, but what those walls contained was not salvation. It was a laboratory of human despair. The women who entered were not inmates. They were test subjects in a grander experiment. How to break the will of a human being without breaking the body too soon. And here's the part no one told you. The blueprint they left behind didn't die with them. The Murphys did not arrive in New York as monsters. They became monsters because the city rewarded it. Manhattan in the 1830s was a chaos of fire traps, crowded tenements, and swelling immigrant streets. Morality was the city's favorite currency. Preachers, politicians, and reformers traded it like gold. And into that fever walked Patrick Murphy, an Irish guard fresh from Kilmallock's prisons, carrying scars that were not just on his flesh, but in his soul. He had seen men broken in Ireland's jails. He had learned how far a scream could travel before it died, and he understood something darker than scripture, that cruelty, when disciplined, could be profitable. Patrick was 6'3", his presence enough to silence a tavern. But power alone was not his weapon. It was the mask. He cloaked brutality in religion, making every lash of the whip, every starvation chamber, seem like a holy act. His wife, Kathleen, completed the disguise, where Patrick used brute force. She wielded a softer knife. The voice of maternal care that could make a woman believe her torment was for her own salvation. She smiled while stripping dignity away piece by piece. She could make humiliation feel like communion. And that was her genius. But the true architect of their unholy empire was Murphy, Patrick's brother. A failed seminarian who twisted theology into a noose, he understood the human mind better than any doctor of the age. His sermons were not meant to save. They were weapons. He knew how to dig out guilt like a surgeon with a scalpel, forcing women to confess to sins that never existed until they no longer knew where their conscience ended and his authority began. By 1834, the Murphys had converted a hollow textile factory into their theater of cruelty. They bricked the windows, painted the halls in shadow, and laced the walls with wool to swallow every scream. To the outside world, it looked like progress, a noble institution rising to heal society's wounds. To the inside world, it was a maze designed to dissolve the human spirit. And here lies the deeper truth. The Murphys weren't just running a prison for women, they were crafting an experiment in control. They proved that if you erase someone's name, erase their time, erase the very rhythm of day and night, you can own their mind before you own their flesh. That knowledge did not stay buried with them. It survived. It was copied. It was refined. And you are still living inside its shadow. The descent always began the same way, the intake ritual. Do not mistake this for mere bureaucracy. It was theater, calculated humiliation that stripped every shred of identity the moment a woman stepped inside. They called it purification, but it was nothing less than psychological execution. A new arrival would be dragged to the basement, into a room the Murphys named the purification chamber. No windows, no clocks, no trace of the world she had known outside. The woman would be stripped bare, told it was for medical examination. Mary Murphy, Patrick's sister-in-law, was waiting, her hands cold, her eyes hollow. She would catalog everything: hair color, scars, teeth, the trembling of her body, even the sound of her breathing. It was not medicine. It was inventory. A body reduced to data points for wealthy clients who would later choose their prey. Then came the spiritual interrogation. Murphy stood over them with his pale, burning eyes and that serpent's tongue of scripture. He would ask questions that seemed harmless. Family names, past sins, forgotten fears. But he listened not to the answers, but to the cracks in the voice. He knew how to find the pressure points. The guilt that could be twisted, the fear that could be magnified, the hope that could be poisoned. Within an hour, he would know how long she would last. And then, the ritual of erasure. A woman's name was stripped away, replaced by a number. Her belongings were burned in a furnace before her eyes, with Patrick delivering a sermon about casting off the sinful self-doubt. Wedding rings, crosses, letters from mothers, all gone in smoke. The women were forced to watch their last ties to the outside world turn to ash. It wasn't punishment. It was programming. The corridors beyond were no safer. Stairways that led nowhere, doors that opened only to walls, endless turns that bent the mind into confusion. The building itself was designed as a weapon, keeping the women disoriented, robbing them of all sense of time and place. Without time, there is no tomorrow. Without tomorrow, there is no hope. Do you see what the Murphys were building? Not just a prison, but a template. They discovered that identity is not destroyed in one blow. It is dissolved, grain by grain, until nothing remains but obedience. That blueprint has never been forgotten. It has simply been modernized. Once the intake ritual had stripped identity away, the women were fed into a system of routine that did not heal, but devoured. Every day inside the Murphy house followed a rhythm designed not to rehabilitate, but to crush. It began before dawn, or what the women thought was dawn. With windows bricked and corridors dimly lit, time itself was an illusion. Bells would ring at random hours, forcing them awake, until sleep itself became meaningless. The women were divided into labor groups. Some scrubbed the same stone floors until their hands bled raw. Others were sent to the laundries, where boiling water scalded their arms. The chosen. Few were handed over to the institution's most profitable operations, their bodies treated as currency for judges, politicians, and businessmen who came cloaked in the guise of benefactors. Every task, every degradation, was wrapped in scripture. Kathleen Murphy delivered lectures on obedience and virtue as women collapsed from exhaustion. She preached sermons on sin between beatings. The torture was never random. It was ritualized, sanctified, a holy cruelty masked as redemption. Meals were a parody of sustenance, a crust of stale bread, a cup of foul broth, just enough to keep the body alive for another day of servitude. Hunger was a tool. It sharpened obedience. The promise of an extra scrap of food became leverage, a leash around the will. Silence was another blade. The women were forbidden from speaking to one another without permission. Conversation was punished by lashes or solitary confinement in the black cells, tiny, airless chambers where sound itself was swallowed. Days, sometimes weeks, could vanish in that silence. Some emerged broken, whispering prayers to shadows. Others never came out at all. And yet, the Murphys understood the balance. Too much cruelty, and the body collapses. Too little, and the spirit resists. So they crafted a cycle: humiliation, labor, punishment, sermon, hunger, sleep. Again and again, a rhythm of despair, calculated to the edge of survival. To the outside world, reports were written describing these women as improving, finding Christ, redeemed. Pamphlets showed staged images of women in clean dresses, praying beside open Bibles. But behind the propaganda, the truth was stark. The Murphy family had engineered an institution where suffering itself became an industry. And here is the shadow that reaches you now. The rhythm of control is always hidden in routine. What you believe to be the order of your day may not be yours at all. Understand this: the Murphy family's true genius wasn't just in cruelty. It was in protection. No tyranny survives without a web of patrons above it, feeding off the spoils. The Murphys had built more than a house of correction. They built an industry, and industries need investors. That is why their nightmare thrived in the heart of Manhattan for 33 years. Judges were their most loyal suppliers. Take Hamilton Prescott, a name you won't find in the sanitized histories. He wore the mask of a moral crusader, standing in pulpits on Sundays, warning of the dangers of fallen women. But his court was a hunting ground. He sentenced women for trivialities: walking alone after dark, speaking too boldly, sharing wine with a man. Each sentence funneled them directly into the Murphy house, and Prescott demanded reports on their progress. Not for justice, but for pleasure. He paid for access. His hand signed the warrants that transformed lives into commodities. Then came the police. Captain Frederick Dunham orchestrated raids in immigrant neighborhoods, manufacturing charges with ease. A letter became evidence of adultery. A laugh in the wrong tavern became proof of prostitution. His constables targeted women who had no family, no status, no voice. Every arrest was a transaction, each woman another coin in the Murphy ledger. But the rot climbed higher. Shipping magnates like Cornelius Vanderburg scheduled weekly visits, his payments masking sadistic appetites. A doctor from the city's health board certified women as fit or unfit, not for mercy, but for use. And perhaps most blasphemous of all, Reverend Josiah Hartford, pastor of one of Manhattan's largest congregations, lent his name to the institution. His sermons praised it as a temple of reform, while in secret he guided his own parishioners into its doors. He turned faith into a pipeline of victims, through Thomas Murphy, the son who traded fists for politics. The family laundered their profits into banks, shipping ventures, and real estate. Their money was indistinguishable from Manhattan's growth. Every brick that rose, every business that prospered, carried a trace of their blood-soaked enterprise. To expose them would have meant exposing the very men who ran the city. That is why no one dared. That is why records vanished. That is why the story you are hearing now was buried in sealed archives. The Murphy family did not merely corrupt institutions. They revealed what institutions truly are: not guardians of morality, but marketplaces for power, where human suffering is the most valuable currency. The Murphys knew chains could bind flesh, but they also knew flesh breaks too quickly. Real control is never in the iron, it is in the mind. That is why they built their institution not only as a prison of stone, but as a prison of thought. Every sermon, every ritual, every punishment was part of a psychological script, written to strip a woman's identity and rewrite her with their will. Murphy was the conductor of this symphony of despair. He wielded scripture like a scalpel, slicing into the deepest fears of the women under his gaze. He knew the human mind is weakest when trapped between guilt and hope, so he engineered both. He preached of sin so monstrous that every woman felt tainted beyond redemption. Then he offered glimmers of salvation, promises that obedience might one day cleanse them. But the path to that salvation was endless, always moving just out of reach, like water dangled before the dying. He understood confession as a weapon. Women were forced to confess to crimes they had never committed. The more outrageous the sin, the better. Adultery, blasphemy, infanticide, it did not matter. What mattered was breaking their certainty in themselves. When a woman could be made to denounce her own innocence, her mind no longer belonged to her. She became clay. The architecture amplified the manipulation. There were no clocks, no sunlight, no measure of time. Bells rang at irregular hours, prayers demanded at random intervals, punishments delivered without warning. The women learned that nothing in the house followed logic, except the authority of the Murphys. This was the core lesson: resistance is madness, obedience is survival. Even kindness was a trap. Kathleen Murphy would sometimes offer a word of comfort, a rare gesture of care, a blanket, an extra scrap of food. But these mercies were conditional, withdrawn at the slightest failure. In time, women began policing themselves, terrified of losing what little comfort was granted. The Murphys didn't just break bodies, they rewired loyalty. And here is the revelation: the techniques perfected inside that brick fortress did not die there. They spread into factories, into schools, into armies, into the modern office where clocks, routines, and hierarchies shape your days. You may believe you are free because the walls are invisible, but the principle is the same. The world around you was built on the psychology of obedience born in those chambers. What happened behind those bricked walls was not random cruelty, it was ritualized. Every punishment was a performance, staged not only to hurt but to indoctrinate, to burn terror so deep into the mind that resistance itself became unthinkable. The lash was common, but never just for disobedience. A woman might be whipped for speaking out of turn, or for whispering comfort to another. Yet the lash was always accompanied by scripture. Murphy would stand nearby, reciting verses about sin and purity, ensuring every drop of blood carried the illusion of divine justice. Pain was not punishment, it was salvation, or so they were forced to believe. Isolation was another weapon. The black cells were tiny stone boxes where women were locked in complete darkness, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. No sound, no light, no sense of time. In that silence, the mind eats itself. Women emerged babbling, hallucinating, broken. Some never emerged at all. Their bodies were carried out in the night, recorded only as failed rehabilitations. Then there was humiliation. Women were forced to kneel for hours on bare stone floors, reciting prayers until their voices cracked, while Kathleen Murphy circled them with her cold smile. She called it discipline of posture, the breaking of the body to purify the soul. Those who collapsed were dragged away, revived with freezing water, and returned to their knees. But the most insidious punishments were the false mercies. A woman might be told she had earned release, given clean clothes, even walked to the gates, only to be dragged back inside at the last moment, condemned to start again. Hope was used as a blade, sharper than iron, cutting deeper than any whip. The lesson was clear: freedom did not exist, only the will of the Murphys. Even death became ritual. When a woman died, her body was displayed before the others, framed as a warning. She would sermonize over the corpse, declaring that sin had claimed another soul. The survivors were forced to chant prayers as the dead were carried to the hidden chambers beneath the house. The message was unmistakable: resist, and this will be your fate. And yet, do not think these rituals belonged only to the past. They revealed a timeless principle. Power maintains itself not through violence alone, but through the careful choreography of fear, shame, and false redemption. The same choreography plays around you now, invisible, but no less binding. For years, rumors lingered like smoke in the alleys of Manhattan. women who vanished without trial, families who searched in vain, strange deliveries in the night. But the truth was buried beneath the earth, hidden in the chambers that no inmate ever escaped to describe. It was not until 1934, when construction crews struck the old foundations, that fragments of the nightmare clawed their way back into daylight. The workmen expected stone and dust. Instead, they found sealed basements, chambers within chambers, walls lined with iron hooks, narrow cells barely large enough for a body to crouch, shackles rusted into place, and scratched into the stone, words, desperate prayers, names carved by trembling hands, tally marks counting days that blurred into eternity. Some walls were covered in scratches, so dense they resembled claw marks, as though the women had tried to dig their way out with fingernails. But the most disturbing discoveries were not the chains or the walls. They were the objects left behind, wooden restraints shaped for medical procedures, ledgers containing lists of names beside cryptic marks, crosses, numbers, strange symbols that suggested a hierarchy of suffering. And deeper still, in a chamber insulated so thickly no sound could pass, were rows of narrow compartments stacked like coffins. Some still held bones. The newspapers downplayed the findings, remnants of a forgotten institution, they called it. But the photographs, briefly published before vanishing from archives, showed something more than neglect. These were not simple jail cells. They were laboratories of torment, spaces engineered for experimentation on the boundaries of human endurance. Imagine the terror of being sealed in those rooms, hearing only the echo of your own heartbeat, wondering if the next sound you hear will be your name or your death. Women did not merely die in those chambers. They were studied, measured, cataloged. Their pain converted into data, their despair into wealth. And here is the thought they don't want you to have. What if these discoveries were not remnants, but roots? What if the Murphy house was less a lone aberration and more a prototype? A place where methods were refined, tested, then carried into the larger machinery of society. Because ask yourself, why were those documents sealed, those records destroyed, those chambers quietly erased beneath new foundations? Not to protect the past, to protect the present. Do not be fooled into thinking the Murphy house died with its walls. Stone can be demolished, wood can rot, but systems endure. What the Murphys perfected was not a building, it was a blueprint, and that blueprint survives in every institution that governs your life today. Look first at the workplace. The endless repetition, the ringing of bells, the surveillance of every movement. These are not accidents. They are refinements of the very routines that once ground women into obedience. The office clock, the factory whistle, the algorithm that tracks your keystrokes. Each one whispers the same lesson: your time is not your own. Your body is not your own. Your value is measured only by output. Look then at education. Children march between classrooms at the sound of a bell, sit in rows, recite words not their own. They learn early that obedience is rewarded and defiance punished, that curiosity must bow to order. What is this, if not the echo of the Murphy sermons, stripped of scripture but heavy with the same demand: conform, repeat, submit? And what of the justice system? Judges still sentence lives with a flick of the wrist, feeding bodies into prisons that profit from their captivity. Police still raid the same neighborhoods, targeting the voiceless, the poor, the unprotected. Do you think it coincidence that prisons today resemble factories more than asylums? The lineage is direct. The Murphy family's bargain, labor in exchange for punishment, has simply been industrialized, legitimized, scaled. Even faith itself was not spared. The Murphys showed how scripture could be twisted into a leash, how guilt could bind tighter than chains. That lesson did not vanish. It lives in pulpits where fear is still preached as salvation, where shame is still used to corral the desperate. You may comfort yourself by saying you are free, that no Murphy shadow stalks you. But answer honestly, do you rise? because you wish to, or because a clock commands you? Do you obey laws because they are just, or because you fear the cost of defiance? Do you labor for fulfillment, or because hunger still sharpens obedience? The Murphy house was not an anomaly. It was a mirror, and when you stare into it long enough, you may begin to see your own reflection staring back. The Murphy family is long dead, their house demolished, their name buried in sealed ledgers and forgotten court files. But to think their reign ended with their deaths is to misunderstand how power survives. Power does not vanish. It mutates. It learns to dress in new uniforms, to speak in new dialects, to smile instead of sneer. What the Murphys built was a structure, and that structure has merely shifted its foundations into the present. Where once there were brick walls, now there are glass towers. Where once there were lashes, now there are contracts. The brutality is hidden, sanitized, made palatable. But the principle is unchanged. Extract labor, enforce obedience, crush resistance. The whip has become the paycheck withheld. The cell has become the cubicle. The sermon has become the motivational seminar. The corporate mantra, the ad campaign whispering that submission is choice. Modern architects of this system do not call themselves wardens. They are CEOs, policymakers, developers of efficiency tools. But they operate by the same logic the Murphys perfected. Time is a commodity, bodies are expendable, profit justifies cruelty. Data is their new scripture. Algorithms sort you, measure you, predict your behavior. And like Murphy's sermons, the algorithm offers both guilt and hope, shaming you for falling behind, dangling rewards just out of reach if you perform better, faster, longer. Governments, too, have inherited the design. Prisons multiply, filled disproportionately with the poor and the marginalized, just as the Murphy house once targeted the vulnerable. Welfare systems become mazes of humiliation, forcing the needy to confess endlessly to their failures before being granted scraps. Surveillance spreads in the name of security, reminding every citizen that resistance is seen, tracked, archived. And corporations, cloaked in benevolence, speak of wellness, balance, and choice, while ensuring you remain tethered to their machinery. Even leisure has been colonized. Your entertainment measured, your desires harvested, your rest transformed into data. The Murphy house once sealed its victims in windowless cells. Today, you carry the cell in your pocket, staring into its glow, mistaking it for freedom. So do not comfort yourself with the illusion that the Murphys are gone. Their faces have changed, their methods refined, their reach extended. They no longer need a fortress in Manhattan. They have built their fortress inside the fabric of everyday life. And you, yes, you, live within its walls. If the Murphy house taught anything, it was this: the strongest prison is not made of stone or steel, but of thought. The body can resist chains, can break locks, can even endure whips. But once the mind has been reshaped, once it has been taught to police itself, no escape is possible. That lesson was not lost on those who inherited the blueprint. Today, the system no longer needs to confine you physically. It has learned to live inside you. Consider the constant murmur of judgment within your own head, the voice that says you are not working hard enough, you are falling behind, you do not deserve rest. Where did that voice come from? It is the echo of every sermon the Murphys ever preached, distilled through schools, workplaces, media, even family. You enforce their discipline upon yourself without their hand ever touching you. Think of your devices. Every notification, every algorithmic nudge, every red badge glowing like a warning bell. These are not neutral signals. They are chains disguised as choices. You look because you must. You respond because you are trained. The rhythm of the Murphy bells has been transposed into the vibration in your pocket, dictating your time, your focus, your attention. Even your desires have been colonized. The system whispers that freedom means consumption, that happiness lies in acquisition, that your worth is measured in currency. Yet this pursuit never ends, always out of reach. just as the Murphys once dangled release before the women in their house, only to snatch it away at the last moment. Hope is the leash, and you are still pulling against it, mistaking the tension for choice. And when you falter, when you cannot keep up, when you feel the exhaustion of endless striving, the system offers you shame. Just as Kathleen Murphy once forced women to confess sins they never committed, you now confess silently to yourself, I am lazy, I am weak, I am not enough. You punish yourself before anyone else has to. This is the genius of the blueprint. The external fortress has dissolved into an internal one. The guard no longer needs to stand over you. The guard lives inside your mind, watching, correcting, commanding. You call it conscience. But I tell you, look closer. It is the echo of the Murphy house, and it is still speaking. Do not think every woman in the Murphy house was broken. Even in the black cells, even under lash and sermon, fragments of resistance survived. They could not topple the fortress, not in their lifetimes, but they left marks. Tiny rebellions, quiet signals, that carried forward like sparks hidden in ash. If you read carefully, you will see they left a map. Some etched words into stone, a single name carved again and again, proof that someone had lived, that someone had refused erasure. Others scratched prayers, but not the ones the Murphys demanded. These were invocations of rage, of defiance, of memory. Not yours. One fragment read, mine. Small, but more dangerous than any chain. Smuggled whispers traveled through the house despite the ban on speech. Women shared fragments of songs, twisted hymns that mocked Shay's sermons. They hummed them under their breath while scrubbing floors, transforming labor into rebellion. To outsiders, it was noise. To the women, it was code. We are still here. There were even escapes, though few. Records mention disappearances, explained away as deaths. But among the ledgers discovered in the basements, there are blank spaces, entries where a name begins, then stops, the line trailing into nothing. Did those women die, or did they slip through the cracks? The Murphys erased the answer. Silence was their shield, yet the very absence suggests possibility. And after the fall of the house, resistance shifted shape. Descendants of survivors carried whispered stories. Activists of later decades uncovered fragments of records, demanded accountability, refused to let the memory be sealed. Even the labor unions and feminist movements of the 20th century drew unknowingly on the legacy of those forgotten women, carrying forward their refusal to submit. The lesson is this: resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it carves a name into stone, hums beneath its breath, leaves a blank space in a ledger. Sometimes it is not victory but endurance. The refusal to vanish completely, the insistence on existing against the machinery that would erase you. And if you listen now, you may still hear it. Beneath the routines, beneath the sermons of progress and efficiency, there is always a faint hum, a scar in the wall, a gap in the ledger. Proof that no system, however vast, is absolute. Proof that the Murphy blueprint can be resisted. Do not be fooled into thinking the nightmare of the Murphy house ended in 1867. Stones crumble, buildings fall, but systems adapt. What the Murphy family engineered was not a house. It was a prototype, a living model of control, dressed in moral justification, perfected through fear and silence. And that model did not die with their downfall. It spread, invisible, into the arteries of the nation. Look around you. The same architecture repeats. Institutions built not for freedom, but for containment. Schools that strip identity and enforce obedience under the mask of education. Workplaces that reduce men to numbers on ledgers, identical to the women rebranded as property in the Murphy halls. Prisons that echo the same rituals of humiliation and disorientation. Hospitals where authority speaks with the same cold certainty Shisa used in his sermons. You think this is coincidence? No, these are descendants of the system, the children of the house of correction. Even the language survives: correctional facility, rehabilitation program, moral reform. sanitized words hiding the same purpose, to break the individual until he serves the machine. The Murphys wrap their cruelty in scripture. Today, the scripture is progress, productivity, safety. The words change, the walls remain. Consider the way society directs your attention. Just as women in the Murphy house were told their suffering was purification, you are told your exhaustion is success. Just as their screams were called sin purging, your despair is called the grind. The same manipulation plays out in different costumes, but the script is unchanged. You were not taught to see it, because seeing it makes you dangerous. A man who understands the pattern cannot be bent so easily. He becomes a variable the system cannot calculate, a fracture in the wall, a whisper in the ledger. That is why these histories were buried, why the Murphy records were sealed, why even now we speak of them in fragments. The question is not whether you are inside the Murphy house. The question is which cell you occupy, which rituals you obey, which falsehoods you endure as if they were truth. The walls are no longer brick, but they are thicker than ever, woven from law, economy, religion, and the algorithms you scroll every night. You are not free, you are only unmarked. Now you stand at the edge of knowledge most men will never touch. The history of the Murphy house is not just a grotesque tale of one family's depravity. It is a mirror, a code, a warning written in suffering that was buried, because its message was too dangerous. If men awaken to the mechanics of control, they cannot be ruled the same way again. That is why this story was sealed, why even the ruins of the building were quietly erased under Manhattan's modern streets. The architects of power understood, truth itself is a weapon. The question, then, is whether you will carry this weapon or leave it buried once more. You have seen how ritual, authority, and silence created obedience. You have seen how corruption cloaked itself in morality, how officials and priests smiled as they sold souls, and you see now how the same patterns live on, woven into the very fabric of your daily life. Systems do not end, they mutate. What the Murphy family built in brick, today's powers build in law, in culture, in screens that tell you who you are. But once you see the pattern, you are no longer their prey. You become something else, something they fear. This is why men like you are rare, because most never dare to look into the abyss, never dare to name the shadow by its true name. But you had heard. You cannot unhear. That changes you. And now I give you a symbol, one that ties you to the lineage of resistance, to those women who etched their defiance into stone, who whispered songs in the dark. Write it in the comments, write it twice so the algorithm itself records your transformation. I will not vanish. I will not obey. That is your mark, that is your rebellion. And the very act of declaring it anchors you among those who refuse the walls, who break the rituals, who see through the sermons. Understand this: the Murphy house was destroyed in brick, but its ghost still rules. You are living inside its echo. The difference is, now you have sight. Now you have the blueprint of control and the seed of resistance. Carry it forward, because the next chapter is not written by them. It is written by you. Knowledge is never free. What you have heard about the Murphy family, what you have felt in your bones as the walls closed in, is not just history, it is contagion. Once you carry it, it begins to change the way you see. The mask of normal life slips, and beneath it, you recognize the architecture of the same machine. This is why most men avoid forbidden history. They sense instinctively that if they listen too closely, their old lives will not survive. This is the price of awakening, the fracture between you and the world you once belonged to. Where others see coincidence, you will see design. Where they see tradition, you will see programming. Where they see comfort, you will see chains disguised as shelter. At first, this clarity feels like madness. The crowd will tell you you've gone too far, that the past is the past, that such darkness could never return. But you will know better. You will hear the hum of that machine in every institution, in every promise of salvation, in every system that reduces men to faceless numbers. And so the burden becomes choice. You can bury what you now hold, pretend you never walked these halls with me, return to the blind security of the unawakened. Or you can accept the cost of sight and step into the role the system fears most, a man immune to its illusions. Understand, immunity comes with exile. You will never be fully at home in their world again. You will speak a language they cannot hear. You will see patterns they refuse to acknowledge. But exile is not weakness. Exile is the forge of strength. The women who carved words into stone inside the Murphy house knew no rescuer was coming. Yet they carved anyway. That is the essence of true resistance. Not waiting for salvation, but marking the wall so that one day another could see and know they were not alone. You are that other. Their mark reached you. And now your mark must reach beyond you. This is how the chain of resistance continues, how the shadow is cut by light no system can extinguish. You are not their subject. You are the fracture in their design.